Hey guys, okay, let's talk about the gender wage gap. So, the standard figure that you hear pretty often bandied about is that women working in the United States are paid 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. Sometimes that's 79 cents. You go to different sources, you get different figures. Um, so, this gap has shrunk over time, but this is where things stand now, that women working full time in the US are paid 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. Um, I think it's worth noting that this standard figure is a little misleading. So this just looks at women who are working full time. But in a sense, the problem is more serious than that. It's worse than that. If you include all working age women, women aged 20 to 54, not just the women who are working full time, the wage gap is a much bigger. So among all working women, the median woman earns $25,000 a year, and the median man earns $41,000 a year. Median meaning that half of women earn more than that figure, half of women earn less than that figure. Okay. As the points out, there are a bunch of different causes of the gender wage gap. On the one hand, there's just straight up gender discrimination in pay, hiring, and promotion. Women being overlooked for jobs, overlooked for salary increases, overlooked for promotions, in favor of men who have equivalent backgrounds, equivalent skills, equivalent competence at the job. Um, but Cliff points to a bunch of other factors which are less obviously tied to this sort of overt gender discrimination, just taking two people who look exactly identical and just preferring the man over the woman. So, one thing that she points to, I think what she considers to be the main factor here, is that men are often able to work longer, more inflexible hours than women. And this is primarily because of an unequal share of domestic responsibilities, right? So, um, women do the majority of the domestic work in the United States. They do most of the child care, most of the elder care, most of the just sort of household maintenance, cooking and cleaning, and that sort of thing. And that prevents them from working uh, uh, rigid hours. So, if you have to pick up your kid from school at 3 o'clock or something like that, then you can't work a 9 to 5. It prevents women from working longer hours because there are uh, times of day when you're just not available to do work outside of the house. Okay, so um, on one cause of the gender pay gap is that largely because of the unequal share of domestic responsibilities in the United States, men are able to work different sorts of hours than women, and they're hired and promoted and giving salary increases commensurate to those hours. So, one point that people sometimes make is that women go into less lucrative fields than men. You might recall the chart from the Me Too piece that we read for last class that showed the most popular occupations by gender. So women are the majority of domestic workers. Women are the majority of home health aides, the majority of nurses. Men, of course, there are also very many low-paying jobs that are predominantly occupied by men, but certainly the highest paying jobs in finance and executives and things like CEOs and things like that tend to upper management tend to go to men. Um, Sometimes this is taken to be a sort of an excuse for the gender pay gap. Well, it's sort of like the thought is that well, women just choose to become um, uh, you know elementary school teachers instead of college professors, or nurses instead of doctors, or home health aides instead of fill in the blank. But this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Is it the case that women choose to go into low-paying fields, or is it that these fields are low-paying because they're because they're occupied primarily by women? So perhaps these fields are paid less because women work in them. So, for example, this is complicated. It's hard to say why this is the case exactly. But for example, as nursing used to be like pretty exclusively like a feminized position, but lots of men have gone into nursing. So the sort of gender balance in nursing has evened out over time. And as that happened, wages for nurses increased. So what this suggests, possibly, is that the less kind of feminized, the less stereotypically feminine an industry is, or an occupation is, the higher the wages are going to be. Okay. One thing that Cliff makes a big deal out of, I think correctly and interestingly, is that the wage gap varies considerably between industries, and it expands and contracts across the lifespan. So take the lifespan part. So the wage gap starts relatively small, although it's there at the beginning of women's careers. It increases throughout the 20s and your 20s and 30s, which is for many people when they're raising young children and have the largest share of the domestic responsibilities, and then decreases again as women enter their 40s and 50s, and that's sort of tells you something about how the changes in the use of a person's time over their lifespan, or it suggests something about how the changes in the uses of a person's time over their lifespan sort of affects the wages that they're able to make. So in particular, she points out that when women leave the workforce for, say, a year to take or more to take care of children, their wages drop precipitously. They're not just like frozen for the year. They go down considerably, and they go down to different degrees in different industries. Okay, how about different industries? So she points out two examples which are really suggestive. One is the legal profession, and one is pharmacists. Okay, so the wage gap among lawyers the gender wage gap among lawyers is really big, and the wage gap among pharmacists these days is relatively small. So what does this suggest? What are the differences between lawyers and pharmacists? One thing is that pharmacists can have, often the jobs for pharmacists are at stores that stay open pretty early and pretty late, so you're able to find shifts. You might be able to find shifts as, say, a working mother who that accommodate your childcare responsibilities or accommodate your other domestic responsibilities. Okay. The lawyers and furthermore, Cliff points out, pharmacists, nobody really cares who their pharmacist is, right? Like, if you go to Duane Reade or whatever, like, I don't know, maybe you're friends with your pharmacist or something. But this is nothing against pharmacists. It's just that nobody has, or very few people have, very intimate relationships with their pharmacists. If you're going to a store to pick up some prescription drugs, you can kind of talk to anybody. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter who's sort of printing out the label for your little pill box or something like that. Okay. So these are two features of the pharmaceutical industry which stand out, that pharmacists are to an extent interchangeable in that consumers don't really care which pharmacist they're working with. They don't have the consumption at pharmacies doesn't depend on an ongoing cultivated relationship between pharmacist and customer. And pharmacies often allow for a range of shifts that could be taken You could work 6 to 2 instead of 9 to 5 or something like that. And this would um, uh, allow people who have childcare responsibilities or other domestic responsibilities to um, find time to work that they might not otherwise find. Compare this with the legal profession, right? So people really care who their lawyers are. You don't just, a lot of the time at least, you don't just go to a law firm and say, give me a lawyer, I don't care which one. If you have a lawyer, especially if you have a lot of sort of legal business over time, you want to work with the same lawyers again and again, people who are familiar with your finances, who are familiar with the nature of the legal matters you've had to deal with in the past. And so people really care about having ongoing developing relationships with lawyers. Also, lawyers, especially young lawyers, are just usually subjected to really, really long hours, especially at sort of, corporate law firms or law firms that do a lot of private business rather than being in the DA's office or a public defender, although public defenders work crazy hours too. So lawyers have longer hours. They kind of have to be on call for their clients to a certain extent, or they have to accommodate client schedules rather than the other way around. Certainly if you have to be in the courtroom at a particular time, you don't get to decide that exactly. The courts decide. Okay, so some of the salient differences, some of the differences that stand out between the pharmaceutical profession and the legal profession: pharmacists have more flexible hours. It doesn't working as a pharmacist doesn't depend on building a trusting relationship over time with your clients. Lawyers have longer, more inflexible hours, and it does depend in that way on building trusting relationships over time. Okay, a little side note. Maybe this is a little dated now. Maybe you just haven't heard of this idea, which is in my opinion, okay. But for a little while, it was very popular to, in discussions of the gender wage gap, to focus on leaning in and to say, the what we need to do to fight the gender wage gap isn't any kind of reform of the workplace or anything that managers need to do. It's something that workers need to do. Workers need to negotiate more aggressively for salary increases, and they need to lean in. They need to not let themselves, women need to not let themselves be excluded from important projects, important conversations in the workplace, and to negotiate salary increases more aggressively. Okay, but it seems like the willingness to be aggressive in salary negotiations isn't really a significant cause of the wage gap. I mean, you could make a bigger, more ideological point here, which is that, there's a, we might say, kind of cult of personal responsibility in the United States, where anytime you see any kind of big picture social problem like the gender wage gap, we think, we just need to all solve this problem by sort of one-on-one, each, putting our noses to the wheel and doing our own part to deal with the problem in our own sort of unique little circumstances, to negotiate our own wages. But, of course, not all problems are solved like that. Some problems are collective action problems. Some problems are better solved by people in positions of power than, small groups of people in positions of power rather than large groups of people who are relatively powerless. So, you might have been skeptical of this lean-in idea for those broadly ideological or philosophical reasons antecedently. Okay, but so much for that. Cliff argues pretty persuasively that even if you weren't ideologically opposed to the sort of whole underlying theory of leaning in, it's just not the case that unwillingness to negotiate salary increases is what causes the gender wage gap. Okay. So, Scrapple, you want to be in the video today? You sweet and spicy boy. I love you so much. Okay. You know, you might look at this and you might say, well, okay, gender discrimination is bad, but to the extent that the wage gap is just sort of caused by women and men making different choices in their lives, and women and men uh, uh, just sort of making different amounts of money. At least as long as you're in a at least as long as you're in a heterosexual relationship that involves financial support, well then, what's the problem? Okay, what if the women do more of the domestic work and the men make more of the money, and they end up sharing with each other, and so it all is sort of a wash in the end. Well, okay. I think there are a few problems with the gender wage gap which are worth taking seriously. So, what are the real harms that are caused by this? Well, I think the first is associated with the sort of straightforward types of gender discrimination, unequal pay for equal work. So if equally qualified men and women with equal seniority are up for the same position, and the woman is passed over in favor of the man, systematically, that's a problem. That's just unfairness. Whatever you think is wrong with unfairness, that's unfairness. There are also social problems caused by having women be financially dependent on men. After all, not all women are in long-term heterosexual relationships with men that can financially support them. Or if you are in a long-term heterosexual relationship with a man who can financially support you, maybe you shouldn't be. So domestic violence advocates often point this out, that women who are victims of domestic violence don't have, who are financially dependent on their husbands, might be prevented from leaving relationships because they don't have the wealth, they don't have the job skills, they don't have the income to support themselves independently, which is, not good. It's not good to keep people stuck in violent or abusive relationships. One serious problem is that the gender wage gap leads to a gender poverty gap. So there are much higher poverty rates for women. Women have lower lifetime savings. They have less retirement savings than men. This is an issue. So maybe you're married until you're 55 to your husband. Even if you both work, there's the wage gap, and the wife earns less than the husband, and then they get a divorce, and all of a sudden, the woman has a third of the retirement savings of the husband or something like that, and we've got a social problem here. Women also generally get smaller Social Security checks than men. Okay. So there are problems associated with the gender gap in poverty and the gender gap in retirement savings. And there are also sort of costs passed on to children. So to the extent that women have the majority of childcare responsibilities and women have lower wages and less wealth, that poverty gets passed on to kids. It also gets passed on to kids because the gender wage gap is most acute at the in the 20s and 30s, when the majority of people are taking care of young children. This is sort of an especially serious problem. Okay. You know what? Let me circle back to that point about unequal pay for equal work, because feminists have sometimes made this point that if we frame everything in terms of equality, Well, sometimes men's and women's lives uh, are different enough that saying that you need equal pay for equal work or people need to be treated equally in equal circumstances, that doesn't get you far enough because well, if men and women live in very different circumstances, they do different work, they have different hours, and so on. Um, then you could justify uh, uh, male domination over women, or justify the wage gap or the poverty gap in those terms. But you know, it might be the case that even if men and women do different kinds of work, not work that is literally identical, it's not, a man and a woman who both put in the same hours at the same law firm and da 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 da, that you have men and women working in different fields, but the feminized work is work stereotypically performed or performed primarily by women is lower paid because it's performed by women. This is on the face of it unjust. It seems like it's an increase in inequality, which isn't which it's hard to find a justification for. Okay. Um, so these are some of the harms associated with the gender wage gap: unequal pay for equal work, inequality that uh, uh, doesn't involve equal work, that might involve different types of work, the unjust consequences of financial dependence on men, higher poverty rates for women, and the costs that are passed on to children. Okay. What are the solutions, though? What are the solutions to this problem? Well, some of these solutions are not managerial. These are solutions which could be enacted perhaps by individual families or by the government. So in individual families, you might just share domestic responsibilities more equitably and just say, well, if what's driving the wage gap in this particular family is that the wife is doing all of the child care and the cooking and the cleaning and the making doctor's appointments and the grocery shopping and so on, you can just keep track of the hours of domestic work that are needed in any given week and make sure that those hours are shared equitably. Um, uh, that's a sort of solution for any given family. You could have government solutions. So, we talked earlier in the semester about wages for housework. So, domestic work in one's own house is unpaid, but it's real work. uh, we in sort of popular lingo or in conventional wisdom, we distinguish between working women and stay-at-home women. But of course, staying at home usually involves a considerable amount of work too. So, we could have government programs to compensate people for domestic labor. That would be wages for housework would be one solution. But we talked about wages for housework and the sort of pros and cons earlier in the semester. Those are solutions on the part of the family and solutions on the part of the government. What about solutions on the part of managers? This is a business ethics class after all. So the question is, what can people in management do to keep the gender wage gap under control in their own workplaces? So one thing you can do is to make hours more flexible, be more like pharmacies than like law firms. One thing that there are a couple of sort of ways of thinking about this. One is to sort of require that people clock in and out at the workplace, work an 8-hour day, but what that 8-hour window is could change over time. So, you're 6 to 2 rather than 9 to 5, or working a late shift or whatever. Another possibility is that you require those same 8 hours, but you give people the opportunity to work from home. God knows this is something that we're talking about a lot in the United States, well, around the world right now, right? A lot of people are if they're lucky enough, like me, to still hold on to their jobs, are working remotely. I'm talking to you on the internet. Um, but I think I have a lot of friends who work in offices, who work in industries that place a great value on sort of clocking in and clocking out, showing up at the right time, leaving, usually a little bit later than the right time, but sort of showing up at the office and making sure that all your hours are put in at the office. But it's 2020. We have Zoom, we have email, we have phones. We can work remotely, and I think we're discovering that a lot of work that managers thought couldn't be done remotely actually can. So, one version of making hours more flexible is saying, okay, people can work have to work their 8-hour shift, and they have to come into the office. But when that 8 hours takes place, can be flexible. Another option is to say, yeah, people have to work their 8-hour shift, but where they find those 8 hours, where they are during those 8 hours is flexible. They can work from home, or they have to clock 8 hours a day, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all at the office. I think one thing that's worth thinking about too is that the anthropologist David Graeber has made this point, that people used to be paid primarily for providing a good or service, and you bought shoes from the cobbler, you paid the tailor to fix the rip in your clothes or take some dress in or something like that. Increasingly, since the Industrial Revolution, we've paid people not for providing goods and services, but we've paid people for their time, right? You pay somebody per hour. You pay somebody to work 8 hours a day, to work 40 hours a week, or whatever it is, okay? Hours here, for a lot of workers, are supposed to sort of stand in as a proxy for, as a kind of quantitative measurement of the amount of goods and services they're producing. But, if you've ever been at an office job, you know that like not all hours are created equally, that you might be required to work an 8-hour day, but you really work for 3 of those hours, and you sort of fuck around for 5 hours, or you just really only have so much work to be done over the course of the day, and there's so you might work less than your full 8 hours, really seriously work less than your full 8 hours because there's not enough work to be done in the day. You might work really seriously less than your full 8 hours because projects, services which were expected to require 8 hours of labor really only required 4, or something like that. Okay. So you might think about, from a managerial point of view, how to pay people for the output of their labor rather than their labor hours. So, if you are a lawyer, how do lawyers are paid by the hour, they bill by the hour. But, what would be other ways of measuring the output of a lawyer's work? How many words they write over the course of the day, how many briefs they file, how many cases they see in court, whatever. You could find other ways of quantifying the work that people do that doesn't involve thinking of it in hourly terms, and that doesn't therefore sort of encourage people showing up to work, but just sort of fucking off and wasting time and having their time wasted, really. Okay, so making hours more flexible at the job site, making more opportunities for people to work from home, and thinking about quantifying work in terms of the output of people's labor rather than their time. So one other thing to think about is just not punishing women in the form of reduced wages for taking maternity leave or for working fewer hours within in order to take care of their domestic responsibilities. So this has some problems. I mean, you know, if people are working fewer hours, but you're not reducing their wages, you think, well, I'm getting, as a manager or as an employer, I'm getting less bang for my buck. Or if you think you have to pay women, ignore maternity leave when you're setting wages for women, then you know, that might create a sort of a perverse incentive not to hire women in the first place. So you know, this has some dangers, but to the extent that you can modify, mitigate those dangers, think about ways of not punishing women in the form of reduced wages for their domestic responsibilities. Okay, one other thing that's really worth thinking about is keeping track of wages by gender. So some companies have wages that are publicly reported. And so, you know, if two people are doing the same job and one is getting paid much more than the other, then they can find out and they can use that as leverage in their negotiations with their employers. This goes not just for the gender wage gap, but this goes for any form of wage discrimination. So it could be racial wage discrimination, it could be disability-based or immigration status-based or anything like that. So so making wages public is one possibility. Now, maybe you think this will just lead to too much workplace drama, you know, oh, somebody finds out that somebody else makes this much money and then they get resentful, but, you know, really it's justified for them to have higher wages for XYZ reasons. So, you know, making wages public is, I think, a really good way to sort of level the playing field between workers and management in salary negotiations, and to kind of get rid of this sort of atmosphere of suspicion. When you don't have wages that are made public, there can be this sort of backbiting or secretive or otherwise nasty office culture where people are always sort of peering over each other's shoulders and trying to look at their paychecks or whatever it is. Okay. But, okay, so maybe you don't want to make, maybe you want to make wages public, maybe you don't want to make wages public. But at the very least, internally, management should have some sense of what the wages are and how the wages break down across significant demographic lines. Are you radically underpaying women? Are you radically overpaying white people? Are you radically underpaying immigrants or disabled people? Okay, so if you don't keep track of, a shocking number of workplaces just don't have the data about this stuff. They don't keep track of this information, but it's very, very easy. Just get a spreadsheet that, you know, somebody in management or in HR who has the, you know, privilege or authority of knowing everybody's wages, just give them a spreadsheet or ask them to maintain a spreadsheet which just keeps track of wages by gender and also by, you know, race and other sort of possible variables that could be the basis for discrimination. Okay, so just being aware of these things, the very least you need to do. You're not going to solve your gender wage gap problem in your own workplace if you don't know that you have a gender wage gap problem. This is really, I think, a no-brainer, just keeping track of wages by gender. And then maybe you could go the extra step of making those wages public. Okay. One last thing that I think is also worth thinking about, and again, this point really generalizes. This isn't just about gender discrimination. This is about all sorts of discrimination or unfairness in how wages and promotion and hiring decisions are made. So if you have here's the big picture point. if you have a possible source of discrimination, race, religion, disability, immigration status, or gender, or anything else, if you have a possible source of discrimination, that discrimination is going to be maximized to the extent to which you allow people to make sort of subjective decisions that aren't accountable to other people on the basis of that that variable. So if people are, so this takes two forms, okay. Or there are two possible solutions which come out of this. One possible solution is to say that the hiring and promotion and salary increase decisions should be made to whatever extent they can in a race-blind, gender-blind, ability-blind, immigration-blind way. So this is harder to do for salary increases and promotion decisions, but is not very hard to do for hiring decisions. So if you are hiring, choosing among applicants in some pool for some new position, at least in the earlier stages, of this application process, you can do whatever you need to do to remove identifying information from people's applications. Remove gendered pronouns, remove proper names which might indicate their gender or ethnicity, and so on. So there's evidence that when in one really mind-blowing study from a few years ago, which was pretty famous, when identical resumes were sent out with sort of stereotypically black names and stereotypically white names for job openings, the resumes with white names were much more likely to get callbacks, were much more likely to be invited in for interviews than the resumes with stereotypically black names. This is so you could imagine that something similar might happen with gender, although I don't know of any studies about it off the top of my head. Okay. So making hiring decisions, or to whatever extent you can, making salary increase and promotion decisions, gender blind, race blind, ability, immigration status blind, and so on. Another way of sort of limiting the possibilities for subjective bias and stereotypes to increase discrimination in the workplace is to make these decisions answerable to objective criteria, to define in advance what are the criteria that we are going to use to hire somebody for this position. What's the checkbox? What are the various checkboxes rather that they need to tick off in order to be hired for this job, or in order to increase their likelihood of getting this job? Work experience, educational status, facts about how much business they've brought into previous employers, facts about who their previous employers were, So if you're going to make salary increases, maybe you could have automatic salary steps that are determined by seniority, or determined by the sales or the number of contracts some worker brings in. To whatever extent you can sort of offload subjective decision making, which is going to be influenced by and infected by people's gender stereotypes, racial stereotypes, and so on and so forth, to objective criteria, which, if you pick the objective criteria in the right way, at least, will rule out those forms of sort of subjective discrimination. Okay, so to sum up that last point again, the more you allow subjective, unaccountable decision-making into some process, the more discriminatory that process is going to be as a rule. One way to limit that is to make the the process race blind, gender blind, ability blind, and so on. Another way to make that process to sort of get subjective discrimination out of that process is to take the subjectivity out of it, to make hiring decisions sort of answerable to objective criteria and to define those objective criteria in advance. Okay, there you go. We did it, guys. We solved the gender wage gap. Okay, I hope that was all right. I will see you next time. Okay, bye.